so much for joining us. My name is Grace Song. I'm the executive director of the Usuli Institute. We are a 501c3 nonprofit educational institute. We are dedicated to elevating critical thinking, ethics, and dignity through education. And so these things are exactly what we're talking about today, focused on all things Palestine. We are so delighted and honored to have as our guest in conversation Lara Alborno. Some of you may know her as Gaza Girl on Instagram. She has a huge following, and she is an incredible, well, first of all, let me give you her credentials. So she's an international human rights lawyer. So I'm going to pull up your bio. She is an activist and lawyer based out of Paris, France. She holds a BS in psychology and a BA in French and Arabic. She obtained her JD from Loyola University, Chicago, and has an LLM in European law from the Université de Paris. She works as a lawyer in Paris, splitting her time between acting as counsel in global disputes and pro bono cases mostly involving refugee rights. She speaks often about the Palestinian struggle for liberation and is host of her own weekly English language podcast called the Palestine Pod. I had, we have a lot of people here in the Usuli community who follow Gaza Girl. We're like huge fans, and it's and I was really excited to sort of prepare and for this conversation by watching a lot of the things that you've been sharing on your social media. A lot of stories, a lot of, and the Palestine podcast is amazing. I had a chance to watch part of your conversation with the Israeli person turned pro-Palestinian, Miko, I forget
Miko Peled, yeah.
Okay, it was incredible. I didn't get through all of it. And then I saw your conversation with Wafa, which was extremely powerful as well. So there, Lara, I just have to say, does so much. I don't know how you do everything. You must not sleep at all. You're probably a little bit like us, but she does a lot to educate people about what is happening on the ground, in addition to the history and the background and all of that. So she is, I'm so excited to get into the conversation with you. And also, let me just say, Dr. Khaled Abou-El-Fadl, as hopefully if you're new to the Usuli Institute and Dr. Khaled Abou-El-Fadl, you are in for a treat. No one speaks truth to power like Professor Abou-El-Fadl. Every single Friday, he gets up on the Prophet's pulpit, as we call, Friday khutbah. And he just calls out, injustice, left, right, center, and, no holds barred. And it's a very cleansing, empowering situation, and so I really encourage everyone to join us at a minimum on the Friday khutbahs. They're live streamed virtually at 1:45 Eastern Time. And also we are simultaneously delving deep into the Quran. We've been doing a very intensive study of it called Project Illumine, Light of the Quran, covering every single chapter of the Quran in detail and pulling out the moral lessons and how it is relevant to our day and age, making the Quran come alive, making us all fall in love again with the Quran, which is something that is difficult to do in this time, hard to convince people that the Quran has any relevance for our day and age. But we have been, covering these for a while, and it's transformative. But I want to also shout out the last Friday khutbah. Dr. Abou-El-Fadl really focused on what's happening in Palestine and speaking the unspeakable truth about the racism that is driving that situation. So we have an incredible opportunity here today to really cover a lot of ground. And what I was hoping for, having now listened to what Lara has out there, knowing what Dr. Abou-El-Fadl has said in the past, to try and bring it all together, because we are really proud to speak to an audience that I believe is highly educated, highly motivated by justice, really interested in trying to understand what it means to be a justice-oriented social activist Muslim today in our world. And certainly I know everyone is aware of Palestine and all of the issues that are happening around the world. But we oftentimes maybe don't go a little bit deeper. And I think this is an opportunity also to arm ourselves with the right language, the right tools, the right education to help our friends understand who may or may not be Muslim and may or may not have the time to really delve deep into this. We understand There's so much out there that is hard to sift through, and unless you are really dedicated, it's hard to cull sort of I forget the term, but the good from the bad, right, and the chaff and from the really meaty stuff. So I'm hoping that through this conversation, we can kind of address a broad range from activism, what's happening real on the ground, to more of the historical, theological, just it's kind of the broad range. But what really inspired me, Laura, in hearing your story, we clearly know that one of the reasons that Palestinians are suffering is that people don't see the humanity of Palestinians as human beings. They don't understand what it means or how it feels to experience, just everything that you experience, through your family, through people that you love, because it's really easy to turn a blind eye. And simultaneously, when we have been covering the Quran chapter by chapter, one of the very powerful lessons that we were told from, God's book is that there's, Surah Qasas, the idea of the narrative. What is the narrative that is being shared? And clearly, the narrative that is out in the media, in the public, is very different. It's geared for power and needs to be dismantled piece by piece so people understand what is the truth of what's happening. So my goal today in this conversation, I'm going to be asking each of you questions and hopefully trying to guide some of the conversation, is to first, let's start at the human level. Like, I would love to know what you've been spending your time doing. You're busy, around the clock. You're posting, you're doing your podcast, you're talking to people live on the ground. You're losing very close people. And I'm so sorry to hear about Joe Gaza. And maybe you can share a little bit about his work, and may Allah grant him the highest Jannah. We are losing people that we love moment by moment. But share with us, take us into your world and humanize it for us, because you represent, as you have said, every Palestinian around the world, and we would love to know your story. And so let's start at the human level.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great way to start. Bismillah. I am Palestinian. My family is from Gaza originally. I was born in Kuwait, stateless, and the daughter of refugees, a refugee myself. And it was only in 1991 that we were obliged to leave Kuwait because of the Iraqi invasion and the large exodus of Palestinians from Kuwait at that time. And that's how we ended up in the United States. So by 3 years old, I'm in the United States. It's not a country that my parents chose, and they themselves had grown up in countries that they did not choose either, between Egypt and Kuwait. And it was at the level of my grandparents that, this was the last generation to be prevented from returning to Palestine. And so already you can understand that there is certainly some generational trauma that exists. I myself was very alert to questions of injustice from a very young age. I remember that one of my earliest memories is being 6 years old and being required to participate in a Thanksgiving lunch at elementary school, where the role play was that we would draw from a hat, and either we would pick settler or native, and then we would all sit together at lunch and eat turkey sandwiches. This is what we did in American elementary school. And I don't actually know if they still do this exercise, but it was one of the first ways that they sort of sanitized for us this question, this question of Thanksgiving, which of course, as an adult, even very early on, I began to understand was ethnic cleansing, was land theft, was expulsion of people who were there first, and it was an injustice. And so I remember, when it was my turn to draw the card, I drew settler and I began to cry. I mean, I was 6 years old, but I knew that land theft was wrong. And I already had in my family my uncle, who was a scholar of Native American studies and who had sensitized me to how what we had gone through as a family was similar to other oppressed people around the globe, that our story was not unique. And so I cried and I cried and I cried, and I didn't want to do it. And my teacher forced me to do it. And she said, decorate, your costume anyway. And I went home that day and my eyes were red, and my mom took a photo of me with my Native American doll. And that, that's when I first cracked a smile that day. And so from a very young age, I become obsessed with questions of injustice. And this continues. I start causing a lot of problems in middle school and, acting out and challenging the narrative of what I'm being told. And, I raise my hand and I say, isn't it true that what happened to the Palestinians is the same as what happened to the Native Americans in my 8th grade social studies class? And I was completely, blacklisted from my social studies class. And this continues. And I eventually pursue a career in law. And, today, as you mentioned in your introduction, I spend about half of my time working on refugee rights, and I represent Palestinian refugees who 73 years later are still stateless, are still refugees, and are still looking for a place to go because Israel won't let them go back. And so that's what I do. That's, what I dedicate a large part of my day job to. But in my in my extracurricular activities, I also try to do as much as I can to raise awareness about the Palestinian struggle for justice and equal rights. And I've been doing this activism work since I was 18 years old. The difference is that right now we are witnessing a global shift in consciousness where a lot of people are paying attention to Palestine who were not paying attention before. And of course, it's not lost on me that this is coming after, the largest civil rights movement that we saw in history following the murder of George Floyd, and this increased sensitivity to questions of racial injustice, segregation, discrimination, things of that nature, right? And so I absolutely credit this drive to learn that I'm now witnessing in people across the world to the movement that preceded this particular instance. So basically, I spend all day now when I'm not working trying to organize and take advantage of this uprising and harness the power of this uprising. I mean, I took a full week off of work because I realized how essential this moment was and how everything that I have done before this, maybe I would not have been able to influence as many people as I can this week because people are waking up and people want to know the story of Palestine. So I've been doing that, whether that, means going on my own podcast or other podcasts or, doing speaking engagements, going on lives, trying to speak to as many people as I can and put out calls to action to pressure politicians in the US. The main thing that I've been calling for now is to pressure individuals to call their representatives to halt the $735 million arms sale, which was supposed to be approved to go to Israel. And finally, we had AOC yesterday and Bernie Sanders today put forward proposals in the House and the Senate to halt this arms sale, because obviously we know that those arms would be used to continue genocide in Gaza, where, my family is and so many other families are. There's 2 million people in Gaza and they are caged there. They cannot escape. So that's, really what I've been spending my time doing. My family, just to clarify, my family was affected. My brother-in-law's family lost 3 apartments in an airstrike on their apartment building. Israel has been attacking residential buildings and essentially turning them to dust. They might be 15, 16, stories high. We've also seen the exact same thing with the Associated Press and Al Jazeera building that Israel leveled, turned to dust. Because they said Hamas was there. And of course, there was no evidence of that. Even the US said that there was no evidence of that, but it doesn't matter because Israel's above the law. And in addition to the 3 apartments that we also lost one relative who was an elderly farmer in the center of Gaza yesterday. You mentioned Joe Gaza, and at Joe Gaza 93 is a friend of mine who's actually a nurse at Al-Shifa Hospital. And I provide a lot of my updates from the ground on Gaza, in Gaza. They come from him because he's providing me the information directly from the people he's treating. And so that's where I get my information. It's firsthand information coming directly from Gaza. So he's still alive and healthy and safe. But he's been through a lot. He told me that he really needs a vacation after this. And I started laughing because Palestinians are very, very, very funny people. So
Thank God. Then maybe I confused him with the journalist. Is there another journalist named Joe Gaza?
So there's a journalist who was killed in an airstrike yesterday, and I did post about it.
Oh, okay. So well, may God bless him and elevate him. But alhamdulillah that, your friend is still alive. So you had mentioned to me that this uprising is different, and I'm wondering if you could tell us why.
Well, I think that for the first time, you're seeing a concerted effort by Palestinians all over Palestine, from the territory that we call 48, which is what is considered Israel, to the West Bank, to Gaza, to Palestinians in exile who are working together collectively to resist 73 years of, settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing by the Zionists. And this is unique because previous, flare-ups of colonial violence may have been attributed to, it's just a war between Israel and Gaza, or, it's just, something's going on in the West Bank. But for once, what we are seeing is all across Palestine, even in the diaspora, even in the refugee camps in Jordan, you had 15,000 Jordanians march to the border with Palestine to show their solidarity with their Palestinian refugee brothers and sisters. And you're seeing this global movement of Palestinians that now is taking the lead and resisting colonial violence. And we've even seen references to this intifada being named the Intifada of Unity, as a means to sort of encapsulate this unity that Palestinians are showing all over the world.
That's alhamdulillah. And I think I want to get into the discussion of how it's being presented in the media, right? Because, clearly what's exciting too is it seems that the world is now becoming more aware of the truth of what's happening on the ground. But it's still a constant struggle, obviously, and it's in all of your social media to address like the qasas, the narrative, right,
Yeah.
and the wording, and the idea. Even like Trevor Noah, the comedian, who's saying, "Oh, it's complicated," and you've spent a lot of time addressing this issue of it being complicated. Like, what would you tell? I'm sure you have a lot of friends who are not nearly as deep into it as you are, but they're educated. They want to understand. They want to know, how can I help, and what do I need to know about this? Like, what do you tell people so they can truly understand what's happening?
If I were to boil the Palestinian story down to its simplest terms, Palestinians are a people who were on their land and who, in 1948, the majority of whom were expelled from their land, and they became refugees. Not only did they become refugees, but they became stateless refugees. Why? Because the state that was established on top of their land expressly excluded them from coming back to it. That state is Israel, and Israel defines itself as a state for Jewish people only. Israel allows any Jewish person from anywhere in the world tomorrow to go settle in Israel and receive immediate citizenship and have all of these excellent benefits, economic benefits, social benefits, what have you, to entice them to come there. On the other hand, Palestinian who was actually from the land, whose grandparents were born on the land, who had a house on the land, who can trace their lineage generations, can't go back to Palestine because Israel won't allow them because we're not Jewish. That is the story. That is the grievance. That is the source of all the injustice. Anything else that we talk about today is a symptom or a reaction to that initial injustice. The problem is that Palestinians have been dehumanized in the media for decades. We often get referred to as Islamic terrorists. Our cause gets lumped in with all the other causes of just crazy Muslims that are fighting, and we don't know why they're fighting. They're just fighting because they're angry. They don't have any legitimate human reason to be angry. Well, that's a very racist and dehumanizing way to look at this issue. If you want to know why Palestinians are angry, ask a Palestinian. Ask a Palestinian what the story of their grandmother is. It's always a story of expulsion. It's either a story of expulsion and dispossession, being removed from our land against our will with violence and being prevented from coming back, or in our case, it's a story of we were in Gaza and my grandfather went to work in Kuwait in 1955 following the Nakba, because during the Nakba, that great expulsion in 1948, many Palestinians were pushed down into Gaza. It disrupted the Gazan economy. There was no work. It was very difficult for people to make money. So my grandfather left to go work and support his entire family back in Gaza. And then what happened was, once he left, Israel prevented him from coming back. So unlike someone who can easily go work in a country and move back, be an expat, move back, you don't lose your nationality if you become an expat. That's an absurd notion. Palestinians were not granted this, luxury. we were immediately excluded, and Israel tried to exclude us at every step of the way. Now, if you're a Palestinian that lives in Jerusalem, if you move out of Jerusalem for a couple of years, you lose your citizenship in Jerusalem and you can no longer go back. Israel has continuously tried to expel us from our land. It's still doing so today, and that's what the story of Sheikh Jarrah is. And that's how Israel was founded. Israel was founded in a great act of colonial violence and ethnic cleansing. And that's just a fact. And the problem is that the Zionists have managed to really cover this story. But I always tell people, the proof is in the fact that Palestinians are the world's largest refugee population. Palestinians are 8 million refugees that are mostly stateless, even until today in 2021, right? And it's not because we don't come from a place. Obviously, we're people, we come from a place. It's just we can't go back because they won't let us because we're not Jewish.
Right. So I want to bring Dr. Abu Fadl into the conversation now, because the issue of Zionism and the story, the narrative that the Zionists put forward is extremely important. It's like you can hear stories of Palestinians who have gone through a lot of difficulty and struggle, but if you don't see them as human, it doesn't touch your heart. You can say, well, yeah, but whatever, but that the minute it's an Israeli who says the exact same words, you have a different feeling in your heart. It's that racism that just emerges. So I wanted to maybe have Dr. Abu Fadl talk about, share some of the things that he so boldly put out there at the Friday khutbah about racism, but also about, I know that you follow a lot of Israeli media, and there's a narrative that's being spun about, and it's a totally different narrative. Just I want, for someone who really is not following sort of the nuances of Zionism, what's the argument, the quote unquote differences of Zionism, there's just a lot of stuff to unpack. Could you take us through some of that, Dr. Abu Fadl? Start with you.
Well, today, the Zionist narrative today has all moved towards the right, to the point that I'm not sure whether the left exists anymore. And in fact, one of the things that is very clear is it's a rather ironic that post Oslo, no one in Israeli circles, no one in the Israeli media speaks about peace anymore. The word Palestinian state is a dirty word. The word, the project of peace that someone like Rabin held, we are really living in the post-Sharon, post-Ehud Barak, post-Netanyahu era, not Rabin, with all his flaws, who represented the left. But the thing that I think is more fundamental, more quintessential is, the narrative is actually quite predictable. Palestinians are rarely referred to as Palestinians. They're always referred to as Arabs. And even when they talk about killing, it's an Arab did this, an Arab died, an Arab killed someone. And so it's an intentional dilution of Palestinian identity. And there's this racist outlook, which it's very much a racial outlook, in that on the one side there are the Jews who, according to Israeli discourse, are all entitled to a homeland in Israel. And then there are no Palestinians, but simply Arabs. And the way that the Israelis solve the entire Palestine issue is to blame the victim and to marginalize all the claims of the victim. So why don't Palestinians just settle in Arab lands? let them all go and find homes in Arab countries. They're an Arab problem, not our problem. There's no right to return because they should all go just live with their ethnic folks, with their racial category, Arabs. Um, Palestinians, the problem is Palestinians love violence and they're fanatic, and they are not at peace with what we Israelis provide for them, which very much like the white man's burden, very much the way cowboys used to talk about Native American Indians. Whatever rights we allow them, whatever progress we allow them, it's more than they would have ever dreamt of, because they are inherently a primitive people, a barbaric people. They really never inhabited this land. They lived on it for centuries, but really never inhabited it. So, although this is one of the most grotesque historical lies, because we know village by village, street by street, what they were called before the establishment of Israel. We know the families that were settled in the homes that exist today that are inhabited by Israeli settlers. The idea that Palestine was an empty land is as absurd as the idea that the Native Americans were not expelled in a genocidal, in a mass genocide from their homeland in the U.S. But even worse, Palestine was a heavily populated area for centuries by a people who had their own national identity, their own history, their own culture, their own social habits. They were known as the Palestinian people, and they were known as the Palestinian people even in the Palestine that was settled in by the Israelites. When we talk about the biblical figures, although the biblical figures are all mythology. I mean, where did Moses really take the Israelites? Where did David really take the Israelites? Where did Solomon really establish it? All of it is mythology. But if you approach it from a convictional perspective, a biblical convictional perspective, you then politicize that biblical perspective, and you say, well, this is the promised land because we have been promised this land to the exclusion of others, and this is a homeland, and this homeland is necessary to save us from any possible future threat like the Holocaust, which is usually what you hear all the time, is that the reason we need this to be an Israeli homeland for all Jews from around the world is because of the Holocaust. No one really answers how is Israel supposed to prevent another Holocaust if it occurs? If a Holocaust occurs against Jews in Russia, what is Israel going to do? I mean, if a country prevents Jews from leaving and decides to exterminate them like China has done with Muslims now, the fact that, furthermore, by what logic do you say because we fear harm, we fear a repetition of the Holocaust, then we are entitled to ethnically cleanse the people? I mean, the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the Israeli colonial project began in 1948 and it never stopped. Palestinian lands continue to be stolen every single week, every single day, every single week, every single month, every single year. And when you think about, you are continuing to expel Palestinians for 70 years, and there's still many more Palestinians, you can imagine how many Palestinians were living there. And the evidence is contemporary. It's during our time. All you have to do is just talk to Palestinians, and they can tell you exactly where their homes are that have been usurped by a settler from New York, or a settler from Morocco, or a Jewish Moroccan or a Jewish Yemeni who just strolls in and Israeli authorities say, here, this is a home for you. And the home, everyone knows, belonged to such and such Palestinian family. But yet they have a preemptory right. How is that not ethnic cleansing? How is that not an apartheid? I mean, I understand the if you are a devout Jew who believes that Palestine is a promised land, I understand your sentiments, but because of a religious conviction that God promised you something, your right trumps all others. Isn't that what we call religious fanaticism in every other context? When you say God gave me an entitlement that trumps the rights of all others, isn't that what we say is religious extremism? But the logic with Israel is consistent exceptionalism. Israel can target the Arabs as a race. And I mean, when Israelis went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque this last Ramadan, they were chanting death to Arabs. They can do that, but it doesn't count as racist. They can say death to Arabs, death to Arabs, death to Arabs, but it doesn't count as racist. They can target Palestinians and call them Arabs and refuse to recognize their nationality because it doesn't count as ethnic cleansing. They can claim a religious entitlement that trumps all others, but it doesn't count as religious extremism. That logic of exceptionalism is what makes Israel and what Israel does such an issue. And I want to add another thing. A lot of people say, well, don't you have Muslims in India suffering in Kashmir, Muslims in China suffering in the genocide against Muslims in China? Palestine is just another tragedy. Well, one, there's a long history that centers around the Palestine, but aside from that history, there's a serious problem, and that Israel, as opposed to India or China or Burma or whatever, is a country that claims to be part of the democratic, liberal Western paradigm. It claims to be part of the Judeo-Christian civilization of enlightenment and human rights and democracy. And that is why Israel plays a very different role, because it is not the darling of China and Russia. It is the darling of Western democratic nations, the countries that go around espousing human rights. So what ends up happening is that Israel becomes an embodiment of a bundle of hypocrisies. And it is these bundle of hypocrisies that then make the entire paradigm of liberal human rights theory and Western civilizational values highly suspect and deeply flawed. If what was done to Palestinians was done by an authoritarian state like China, that has never claimed to be democratic and is condemned universally by the West, it would be one thing. But the fact that it's done by a state that is embraced by Western institutions, by our countries, the fact that Israel can do whatever it does, and yet, the ex-members of the IDF can, after they're done doing whatever they do to Palestinians, then a lot of them immigrate to the United States and come to the U.S. and start a business and settle in the United States or teach in the academia. There's a famous professors in very prestigious universities all over the United States. All of us know that they were scholars that worked for the IDF. Can you imagine a professor who was an ex-member of Hamas in the US? It wouldn't happen. Israel is the constant moral exception to all else. You can kill Palestinians, you can torture Palestinians, you can imprison Palestinians, you can do whatever you want to Palestinians, and no one holds you responsible whatsoever. You come as a hero. It was embraced by Western institutions. That is what I have a moral problem with. I'm just, hypocrisy is a moral disease. And if we are going to point the finger at countries like Saudi Arabia and say you're morally bankrupt, then we must also point the fingers at countries like Israel and say you're morally bankrupt. We can't have it the way things go on right now.
So this underscores to me the absolute importance and centrality of language and perception, and people calling out. I mean, clearly there's an enabling because we recognize what's going on, but what is it, like, why is it that Muslims are so impotent, for lack of a better word, whether it's because other countries are complicit. We know clearly that from what you've shared, Dr. Abu Fadl, in halakas and khutbahs, that some of the major Muslim leaders with the most wealth and power are right in bed with Israel. And this definitely elevates the need for people like Lara and others who are vocal, educated, articulate, social media savvy, to redefine the playing field, because I don't know how else. We don't have the money, right? But if you could maybe just speak to the complicity of some of these other Muslim nations, and then maybe what you see, that could be done. From I want to take this to sort of like from a Muslim point of view, what are we as Muslims, able to do? What it is our duty to do? What can we do? And just understanding the context.
I'm eager to hear Laura at so many levels, but let me just say that one of the post-colonialism in a lot of the Muslim countries, there was a historic moment where a lot of governments in especially Muslim Arab countries had to decide whether they pursue a path of development independent of their past colonial masters, or whether they take the easy way, the easier route, and that is to attach their own development to their past colonial masters. And the harder path was a path where you basically say, I'm going to develop myself from scratch and forget my past colonial masters. It required integrity, it required democracy, it required anti-corruption, it required self-determination. And most Arab Muslim countries which are authoritarian governments decided against that because they were too corrupt. And it was a much harder route. And what they've chosen instead is to develop by going back to their past colonial masters and saying effectively, okay, help us stay in power. And in return, all the privileges you had as colonial powers, we're going to allow you. But now we're going to allow you through our own legality. As native rulers, we are going to allow all the privileges, all the entitlements that you have for. We're going to give them to you. In return, you give us a share of the pot. Give us more money. Give us a percentage of give us a huge percentage of profits from oil industry, for instance, or from, in the case of Egypt, the gold mines that are all exported, whatever is mined from the gold mines in Egypt, is all exported to Europe as raw material. Europe, processes it and then exports it back to countries like Egypt and so on. But what happened is that these rulers were not just autocrats and corrupt and dictators. They were also adopted the racist attitudes of their colonial masters. And part of the racist attitude was to look at the Palestinian people and blame the victim. So all the mythologies that the Israelis had spread about the Palestinian people, like, for instance, oh, Palestinians gave up their own country. Oh, the Palestinians sold their land to Jews. They just wanted the buck, and so they just sold the land to the Jews, and then, you know, so it's their fault basically. Oh, Palestinians are just fanatic, and they uh, 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 you know, you blockade Gaza, 2 million people in its suffocating, illegal, unlawful blockade, and yet if they scream, if they are in agony, you blame the victim and say, how dare they? You know, why don't they just shut up and take it? So, and so that is exactly what happened with, as Laura would, I'm sure, just being born and raised in Kuwait, you as a Palestinian in Kuwait and the Emirat and Saudi and Bahrain, you are not a second class person. You are a third, fourth, fifth class. I mean, you know, the Americans come ahead, the British come ahead, all the Europeans come ahead. And then after that, the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, the ones who they come ahead, and then maybe the Egyptians come ahead, the Syrians come ahead. You know, then maybe the Palestinians, maybe the Palestinians ahead of Bangladeshis and Sri Lankans, maybe after. It depends, but definitely you are dealt with your own by your own people from a racist perspective, as an inferior class of people. And that is why so many Palestinians, actually, Laura's family was fortunate that they had someone that had an in the United States, because a lot of Palestinians' families, after their residency runs up in Kuwait, expires in Kuwait or Saudi or whatever, they're stateless without a right to residence anywhere in the world. And I used to work in Philadelphia with Palestinians, lifers who were detained in US immigration facilities because they were stateless and because no country would take them. I mean, I don't kid you. These were people who came to the US, let's say they were raised in Kuwait, Palestinian. They don't have a citizenship, obviously, they just have travel documents. Then they reached the age of 18, their permanent residency in Kuwait expired at age 18. Then when they finished their education in the United States, they didn't have residency in the US, but they couldn't go back to Kuwait, and no other country would take them. So what would happen to them? Many of them would be detained for life, and they've done nothing. And I would work just to get them a waiver to allow them just to exist at the mercy of the government outside of the detention center. That's the fate of a lot of Palestinians. And then when you go to human rights activists who are very pro-Israeli, they basically look at you and say, yeah, we understand it's hard, but you have to stay focused on the Jewish homeland, because that's what really matters. You know, it's all worth it for the sake of the Jewish homeland. From what perspective? From a deeply racist perspective, it's worth it for you so they can go to hell? I mean, that is what the thing that drives you truly bananas. Now, what has developed, especially in the Trump era, was this, and this was sort of the brainchild of Kushner and his group of spoiled brats. I mean, these Arab leaders who are very rich and very corrupt, and all fellow Kushner buddies, was the idea that, you know what, let's solve the Palestinian problem once and for all. Let's all make peace with Israel. And basically, we give Palestinians a choice. We've all made peace with Israel. We're all normalized relations with Israel. We're all buddies with Israel. Now, you Palestinian people, if you insist on a homeland and on a right of going back to your homes, well, you die. You have another choice, and that is, we'll give you jobs in these free trade zones in Sina, Egypt, and in the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia. So you get to have good jobs and good pay and forget your homeland. That's what Kushner came up with. Typical, Israel refuses to get the point. You're not going to beat the national dream out of the Palestinian people. You're not going to beat the sense of dignity out of Palestinian people. so many Israeli friends told me the problem, and I hear this on the Israeli media all the way, by the way, and you know that I follow Israeli media, is the problem with the Palestinian people is that they haven't realized they've been defeated and there is no point to resistance anymore. I hear this all the time. If the Palestinian people would just wake up and realize that they've been defeated, that would solve all their problems, because they would stop struggling and they would just do what they're told. And then all problems would be solved. How racist is that? And I actually would like to hear Laura on this, because I hear this all the time. I mean, there isn't a day that I don't turn on Israeli TV that some talking head doesn't pontificate about how the Palestinian people haven't realized they've been defeated a long time ago, and it's time for them to realize it and surrender.
Laura, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I have so much to say. I mean, look, I think this is part of the dehumanization. This is part of the dehumanization. People that promote these sorts of ideas, Zionists, they fundamentally don't understand that Palestinians are humans, just like any other human. And no human would accept to be expelled from their home by someone who shows up and says that God gave it to me. I mean, it's an absurd notion. And the idea that we would somehow just lie down and die and accept an invasion into our house and just forget who we are and forget the civilization that we had and forget the land of our ancestors and our, our parents and our grandparents, it's absolutely insane. I also think it's a lie. The idea that Palestinians have been defeated, I strongly disagree. Palestinians have not been defeated. If you look back at the colonial example of French Algeria, it lasted much longer than what we are dealing with now. They fought for what? They struggled for 130, 150, I forget, however many years, until they freed themselves. Palestinians are now in the 73rd year of ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism in the land of Palestine. Zionist colonialism, because of course there was British colonialism before that, but Zionist colonialism has lasted for 73 years. So I think it's an absurd notion that, if we would just lay down and die, all the problems would disappear. But actually the question is, problems for who? The problems for the Israelis might disappear, but the problems for the Palestinians, who are people who are engaged in a struggle for their rights, would not disappear. It would simply aggravate and accelerate. We are fighting for our rights. This is what people don't understand. And these rights are not some sort of imaginary rights. These rights are rights that are enshrined and are given to us and belong to us under international law. Leaving aside the question of moral rights and, from an ethical perspective, who is right? I just want to say something else. This idea that, they're Arabs, they can just go to Jordan. Why don't they just go to Saudi Arabia? They can go anywhere else. I mean, we would never accept this discourse with any other people. Can you imagine if a foreign people, from Europe shows up in Colombia and says, get out, these are our homes now, but you can go to Venezuela because they speak Spanish too. We would never accept that type of reasoning. We would never accept that type of reasoning. But even worse, the notion that, the Zionist claim to the land of Palestine rests on the idea, and this is something they've been propagating lately, especially in liberal Zionist circles, that, the Jews are indigenous to Palestine, so we have the right to be there. Okay, Yami, you can come, but you cannot expel me. And many Palestinian scholars have written about this. If the Jewish people wanted to come and settle in the land of Palestine and just live and work alongside the people who were already there and integrate into that community and all participate with one another in some sort of a democratic form of governance, there would be no problem. But this is not what they wanted to do. They expressly wanted to expel us, and they have been talking about it since the beginning of the modern political Zionist project. You can look back at the writings of Theodore Herzl and Jabotinsky and Weizmann and all of these guys, and Ben-Gurion. They spoke very clearly about expulsion. They spoke very clearly about the fact that we were native. They used the terminology, and they even used the terminology of colonialism. They referred to themselves as colonists. And I just want to add on this point as well that, these Zionists didn't come out of nowhere. They were very heavily inspired by European settler colonialism in America. Okay, they studied it very much, and so much so that when Herzl was considering where to set up this homeland for Jewish people, and he was thinking maybe we'll go to Uganda, maybe we'll go to Azerbaijan, maybe we'll go to Mozambique. No, let's go to Palestine, because we can capitalize on the religious significance of the land of Palestine for the Jewish people in order to harness this external support, which they were able to get from the British at the time that they committed the Nakba. The reason why the Zionist project in its inception was radical and crazy and nobody believed in it, and they thought it was weird, they had no supporters, right? But by the time you get to the 40s and you know, in particular, like right before the Nakba, they were able to gain the support of the British in terms of finances, but also in terms of arms. And that's the point in which they're able to realize, you know, this national project for the Jewish people. But this idea that Palestinians are just expected to lay down and die. I mean, I always ask people, what would you do if somebody knocked on your door and told you to leave and said they were moving in and that you must leave? And I think it's really important for people to understand that's not what they did. They showed up with guns and bombs and they raped our women and they killed our men and they stole our babies and they raised them as their own. I mean, these are documented stories. And we were there. I mean, you can look, there's, you know, it's all documented. There's Walid Khalidi writes in Before Their Diaspora about the Palestinian civilization. I mean, it's a book this big filled with stories and accounts. There's entire books that describe every single Palestinian city and village and who lived there and what, you know, what type of agriculture they had and what type of industry they had and which families were there and, you know, how many people were there and how many houses were there. Every single fact about our civilization was documented. You could even look at photos of the Library of Congress in the United States. They have them. Palestine pre-48, we were there. You know, so for me, the dehumanization is really the root of the problem. Why would you expect Palestinians who are human to accept something which you yourself would never accept? You know, go to Texas, show up at some guy's house, tell him that you're moving in because God told you so. He'll shoot you. He'll shoot you in the face. I mean, this is an absurd notion. And when I say this, I'm not exaggerating, because we all saw the video of Jacob the Settler, which kind of went viral, because he's one of the guys that's showing up in Sheikh Jarrah to take over one of the houses of the Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. Jacob the Settler is from Brooklyn. He has an American accent. And the Palestinian woman, Muna al-Kurd, who's standing in her family's yard, and she's saying, Jacob, you know this is not your house. And he said, well, if I don't take it, somebody else will. So what are you complaining about? You know, this notion that ethnic cleansing is inevitable, that it's just how it has to be, that it's independent of him entirely.
He tells her, well, you know, if I don't steal your home, someone else will. You know, why are you blaming me? I mean, it's mind-boggling. And, you know, it's mind-boggling that, do you know this whole thing that happened with the mosque in Turkey, the church that was turned into a mosque in Turkey? What is it called? The Hagia Sophia, yeah. You know, but I have in my library a mosque by mosque documentation of all the masajid and mausoleums that were turned into homes or into animal barns or and given to Jewish settlers, and no one ever talks about that. And the thing that a lot of people, I mean, I want to underscore this, is that there's a major betrayal of the Palestinian people by people whose psychology and mentality is thoroughly colonized. They were betrayed by the Egyptians. They were betrayed by the Saudis. They were betrayed by the Emiratis. Let's not forget that the Saudis have jailed all Palestinian activists who used to live in Saudi Arabia. They're in prison now. The Emiratis have done the same. The Bahrainis have done the same. The Omanis have done the same. The betrayal of, and because these countries don't care about what the Palestinians need or want, they care about what their colonial masters want. It's far. Jared Kushner is worth a million Palestinians for the Saudis or for the Emiratis or for the Egyptians, and that's what makes is so obscene. The, it's an injustice that stares everyone in the face, and people who are highly educated, people who are very accomplished in the human rights field, people who are very accomplished in the civil rights field, when it comes to this issue, they get absolute, just complete blinders. And I'm talking about people that I highly respect, highly admire as accomplished human beings. But then I see them when it comes to Palestinians, and their eyes glaze over. They're like, they can't think of Palestinians as human beings, and they can't think of Palestinians as a people who can be targeted by the Saudis or by the Emiratis, who are far more interested in pleasing Israel than pleasing Palestinians. And this is the reality that we live with, even among a lot of American Muslim leaders, because you asked about American Muslims. I mean, all the American Muslims who are on the Emirati payroll, on the Saudi payroll, you see the silence. And it's because they know that if they support Palestinians, the Emiratis are going to stop writing these checks. And that's part of the betrayal of the Palestinian people, and part of what is so immoral about what we have to live through.
So
Can
let's
I just
take
say
a.
something? Can I just
Oh,
say
please
something?
do. Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the problem doesn't end with Jared Kushner, because Democrats or Republicans, it's the same for Palestine. You'll see that all of the terrible policies that were completely contrary to international law that were enacted during the Trump administration, they were not reversed during the Biden administration. So, for example, the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem, which cemented the idea that East Jerusalem is also for Israel, which is completely contrary to international law. Nobody accepts the claim that East Jerusalem is Israeli. I mean, this is a total lie. It's East Jerusalem is officially occupied militarily, and what must be done in East Jerusalem is a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from East Jerusalem. However, the U.S. takes this position during the Trump era, and Biden does nothing to reverse it. In fact, the DNC says very clearly, no, we're not going to reverse the decision. We're going to keep the embassy there. And so what we're seeing now with this flare up of colonial violence in East Jerusalem, the continued ethnic cleansing of East Jerusalem, it's, I think, made possible by the fact that you have sort of this green light from the U.S., which just last year said, okay, no, it's fine. We're gonna make this your capital. So that's the green light to go ahead and take more land from more people. But just want to say one last thing about Arab governments. I can't speak for all Palestinians, but I speak for myself when I say that Palestinians are not waiting for anyone to liberate them. Palestinians are not waiting for Arab governments to liberate them, certainly not authoritarian despot governments who are not democratically elected, who are hated by their own people, who jail their own people, who suppress any form of civil liberties and expression and any of the rights that we would traditionally associate with free societies. Okay, those people are not going to free us. Now, of course, I make the distinction between the people and the government, but certainly the government will not free us. I mean, their own people are not happy with them. So how are they going to come free the Palestinians? Right? And I think what Palestinians have understood in this current uprising is we can't wait for anyone. We can't wait for America. We can't wait for the EU. We certainly can't wait for the PA, which canceled elections not long ago, the first elections in 15 years. And, they're completely subservient to Israel, and they are essentially bowing down to their own colonial master. We can't wait for Hamas either. They have simply no power. I mean, they have been subject to a land, air, and sea blockade for 15 years. They were elected as a de facto government, and they don't have any ability to do anything, right? So I think that it's really important for us to keep in mind that what we're seeing is an uprising of the people. The people are going to free themselves with the help of God. And I believe that. I don't know if it's going to happen today. I don't know if it's going to happen next year. And I would love to hear Dr. Khalid's thoughts on that. But for me, I see this as a people-led movement. We're not waiting for anyone anymore.
Well, I've heard you say very specifically elsewhere that there are certain things that Palestinians want. Can you share with us what those things are from the people that want to help?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Palestinians, first and foremost, want political solidarity because so many of the themes that we have touched on in this conversation go back to the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, expecting them to do the unthinkable, to just give up their land that they were on, that was theirs, that nobody else in the world would accept, right? And so, in order to counter this dehumanization that has been so present in the rhetoric of Palestine, we need to very vocally extend political solidarity to Palestinians. And that comes from all oppressed people and even people with privilege. Anyone in any position, it is valuable for them to our cause when you stand up and say, I support you in your struggle against ethnic cleansing and, standing up for your rights against this colonial force that basically, governs via an apartheid system and is depriving you of your rights. It's very, very critical when we hear those statements, especially lately. I've been relying a lot on the statements of Black activists in the United States. Black Lives Matter movement issued a statement of solidarity with Palestinians, not the first time, but in the recent, within the context of the recent events, took a very clear statement against settler colonialism. And I've used that statement to lift me up. When oppressed people band together, we can be very powerful. And this is exactly why our oppressors have always tried to divide us, whether it be internally, like divide Palestinians themselves, or divide oppressed people from sympathizing with other oppressed people across the globe, right? So first and foremost, political solidarity. What does that look like? It looks like sharing our posts, telling our stories, amplifying our voices. Our voices have been suppressed in the mainstream media, and you have been fed a pro-Zionist narrative if you live in America your entire life. So what you are waking up to right now is a completely different narrative based on people who have lived experiences of racial discrimination, segregation, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism. This is our reality. This is our lived experience as Palestinians, and it is not, it's not a reality that anyone would accept to live under. So when you lift us up, it helps us tremendously. Also, in 2005, Palestinians put out a call, and I want to emphasize this call came from Palestinian civil society. And what is the call? It's the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, meaning we're calling on people of conscience all over the world to boycott Israeli products, especially the ones and especially the companies that are involved in our oppression, the companies that operate in the West Bank, for example, in the settlements. This is occupied land. So we're calling on, entities, governments, church groups, whatever it may be, to divest their investments from Israeli companies as well. We're calling on governments to sanction Israel. We're calling on our own government in the United States not to give Israel $3.8 billion every single year. Starting in the 1980s, they were giving them $3 billion a year, and now it's up to $3.8 billion. We're calling on that to end. First and foremost, if it's not going to end, it must be conditioned on compliance with international human rights obligations. But the goal is for it to end, because we need that money in America. The American people have an interest in this, if for no other reason than their money is being used to carry out human rights violations when it could be used to help Americans with things that they desperately need. So call on your representatives to sanction Israel, end aid to Israel. Certainly, if you're watching this today, write to your representative, tell them to support the resolutions that were put forward by Bernie Sanders and AOC yesterday and today that are calling for a halt, a stopping to the arms sale that is going to be made of $735 million of weapons to Israel during a genocide. So this is what we're dealing with. We are up against very brutal oppressors that have a tremendous amount of power. And as Palestinians, what we have on our side is truth and the cause of justice. And I believe that we will prevail. But we have to work together in order to do this. It's dua and action. It's not just dua. We're not going to get there just with prayer. We need both hand in hand.
You had mentioned that there is a list that the UN put out of companies specifically that we should boycott. These are, and I know you had mentioned companies like Caterpillar, for example, that creates the bulldozers that bulldoze Palestinian homes. We'll share that, but if you could just say something about, because I know that it was very powerful when you were talking in another live about BDS, and if you could just point people, I guess, to where.
Yeah, so first of all, the BDS movement itself has a website. You can go on and see what are the companies that are being targeted. It's important to keep in mind BDS is a targeted campaign of boycott. So specific companies are being targeted, and the idea is that with a targeted boycott, we're able to have a bigger impact instead of people just randomly boycotting random companies. So first and foremost, I encourage people to consult the website of the BDS movement, which you can find online. I don't have it off the top of my head, but somebody can throw it in the chat. Second of all, the UN list. Israel worked very hard to suppress the publication of this list for years. And finally, it was recently published. And someone said they would put that in the chat as well. But basically, it's a list of mostly Israeli, but also American and European companies that operate in the settlements on occupied land. And so the idea is that you can take from this list the companies that you should also be boycotting. And on that list includes things like Booking.com, TripAdvisor, Airbnb, so companies that we're probably using, on a daily basis if we are traveling. So keep in mind that those companies are certainly targets for boycott, and then anything else that the BDS movement itself has identified as a target for boycott. And then also there's local BDS chapters all over the world. So wherever you live, find out where your local BDS chapter is and what specific campaigns they have going on, because they may have things that are specific to your area. And this is absolutely key, because this boycott was essential in bringing down apartheid South Africa. And so Palestinians are being inspired by Black South Africans who themselves called for a boycott of South Africa and were able to free themselves because they were able to raise the global consciousness to the point that South Africa was totally blacklisted. I mean, they were not even allowed at the Olympics. I mean, they were blacklisted from the rest of the world. Apartheid had to end because the cost of maintaining it grew higher than the benefit that they were actually reaping. And I want to just add that, while Palestinians are inspired by Black South Africans, it's Israel that armed and funded apartheid South Africa. So we know very clearly that wherever there is an oppressor, Israel is not far, because Israel is an oppressor like any other oppressor, right? Israel was involved in arming and funding, the Mexican government in its oppression of the Zapatistas in Chiapas. Israel was involved in arming in the 1980s various countries in Latin America, including El Salvador. Committed really heinous crimes against native indigenous people. This is Israel. This is who Israel is. But Palestinians are a native people. We are fighting for our rights. We are fighting for the right to stay on our land, very much like native people in America. And we are also fighting a rights struggle, very much like Black people in America, because we have become racialized because they don't give us our rights because we're not Jewish. Israel is an ethno-state, and it deprives people on the land of rights because they don't belong to the right religion. People have to keep that in mind. This is not a democracy. They want you to believe that they're the only democracy in the Middle East. It's simply not true. It's simply not true. The facts disprove it. And even Beit Salem, which is the leading Israeli human rights organization, has called the regime that Israel maintains from the river to the sea a regime of, quote, Jewish supremacy. That sounds just like white supremacy, because that's what it is. Zionism is white supremacy. Zionism is racism. And people are finally starting to wake up to that.
Alhamdulillah. I want to ask Dr. Abou Fadl to talk about the issue of Al-Aqsa Mosque, because I know that there's a lot of maybe confusion or purposeful confusion among Muslims about because there's that whole effort to try and convince Muslims that Al-Aqsa Mosque is really not significant, that we it's okay to let it go. Can you, for people who are not aware, can you talk about that?
Okay, first, I just want to say about everything that Laura said underscores to me how dangerous it is when you have American Muslim leaders who are vague on the issues or who obscure the issues. Because I've seen American Muslim leaders come out, and these are, again, usually American Muslim leaders who are in the pockets of the Emiratis or Saudis or something, but they, say, oh, we call for peace in Jerusalem. This conflict is very unfortunate, as if there is no aggressor and victim, as if you have two parties, equal parties that are at conflict with each other, and it's an absurd. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Israel's power compared to the Palestinians, it's like the difference between, you know, a martial arts black belt compared to a child. You know, no matter what the child does, he can maybe, you know, throw a rock and bruise the martial arts expert, but the martial arts expert ultimately can beat the child to a pulp, and that's exactly what happens. You know, so I'm just extremely alarmed by American Muslim leaders who try to convince American Muslims that this is not their fight, that this is not an issue they should be interested in, or that this is a complicated issue that they should sit on the side. You know, it's extremely alarming because they obscure morality and ethics for American Muslims. And then, you know, then they become also uh, oblivious towards moral positions, whether it involves Black Lives Matter, whether it involves Palestinians, whether it involves, you know, authoritarian, despotic authoritarian governments around the world. And this connects to the issue of Jerusalem because these same leaders also obscure the theology of Jerusalem in Islamic history. So to be very clear, you know, there back in the 90s, there was an Israeli scholar who published an article. It was at the time considered a completely wacky, crazy article, and in it he said that the Aqsa mosque that the Quran talks about is not the mosque in Jerusalem; it's a mosque in Ta'if, Saudi Arabia. And it's a little, you know, this abandoned mosque in Ta'if that if you see it, it's nothing. And what did he base this on? He based it on absolute the most flimsy historical research you can imagine. I mean, it was clearly an ideological project, a politicized perspective, you know, dressed up in the language of scholarship. But then, lo and behold, we find these. The years go by, and then there's an Egyptian scholar called Yusuf Zidan who plagiarized the article, and Yusuf Zidan made the same claim to appease the Sisi government in Egypt that doesn't want to support the Palestinians. And then a Saudi fellow called Dahi Khalfan, who also took what the Israeli scholar said and what the Yusuf Zidan said, and other Emirati, this Emirati uh, uh, guy, so-called Sheikh, what's his name? Anyway, he's well known. He's Wasim Yusuf. Wasim Yusuf. Uh, so what did they start saying? They basically start saying, you know what, this Aqsa mosque is not really important to Islam at all. The Aqsa Mosque was really built for the first time by the Amawites about 100 years after the Prophet died. And let's all focus on Mecca and Medina and just forget the Aqsa Mosque. Of course, the problem with this is, I mean, where do you begin? You know, right? Muslims prayed towards Jerusalem for many years. They didn't pray towards Ta'if, they prayed towards Jerusalem for many years before the Qibla was changed to Mecca. Second, the whole point of the night journey, Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, is that the Prophet traveled from Mecca to Al-Quds. Why? To underscore the fact that this is the Islam of the Prophet Ibrahim, this is the Islam of the Prophet Musa, this is the Islam of the Prophet Isa, Moses, and Jesus, that Muhammad is the last and final testament of the monotheism of all these prophets. And that point could not have been made except if you theologically connect Mecca, which was built by the Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail, and Al-Quds, which was blessed by Allah as the center of monotheism in the world. So that, you know, and that is precisely why Umar ibn Khattab, you know, shortly after the Prophet died, the companions of the Prophet, the closest companions, knew that unless Al-Aqsa Mosque is reconstructed, and unless Muslims kick out the Byzantines from Palestine and free Palestinian people from Byzantine control, Islam, the Islamic state, the Islamic message, Islamic civilization is not going to go anywhere. All the companions of the Prophet that were raised by the Prophet understood the importance of the Aqsa Mosque. So to come now 1400 years later and try to say, oh, you know, Umar ibn Khattab got it wrong, Ali ibn Abi Talib got it wrong, all these companions are buried in Palestine, by the way. You know, there's so many companions of the Prophet who have mausoleums in Palestine. This betrays the blood of so millions of Muslims who sacrificed their lives, and not just Arabs, Muslims who Persian, Turks, Kurds, every ethnic group that sacrificed their lives defending Palestine from the Crusades, reconquering Palestine after the Crusades occupied Palestine. All these millions of souls that lost their lives and were buried, and their graves are still there in Palestine. And you come and say, oh, the old don't count because, you know, now the Emiratis want to enjoy Ukrainian prostitutes and not be disturbed by the Palestinian cause. I'm sorry. Or the Saudis, they want to enjoy, you know, these rock concerts thrown by the most expensive rock stars and not be bothered by the Palestinian issue. That's, you know, a betrayal of historic proportions. Let me be very clear on this point, that as a theologian, as a jurist, if you take Jerusalem outside of Islam, Islamic monotheism stops making sense. Islam becomes an Arab religion, not an international religion. What makes Islam a universal message is Jerusalem, is Palestine. If you just confine Islam to Mecca and Medina, then Islam is just a Bedouin Arab phenomenon. And that's exactly what the Saudis want, because they don't want the Iranians to have a say, they don't want the Turks to have a say, they don't want the Indonesians to have a say. Islamic monotheism and the position of Muhammad as the final prophet and the Quran as the final revelation no longer makes sense if you take Jerusalem and the Aqsa Mosque out of the equation. Let's be very clear about this. The Aqsa Mosque is not the third holiest site in Islam. It really bothers me when I hear Muslims say that. The Aqsa Mosque is a holy site in Islam equal to Mecca, equal in status to Mecca. It's Mecca and the Aqsa Mosque. That's it. Now, this is the history. This is the theology. Deal with it. You know, it's not my problem if, you know, that's going to make a difference. You're not going to get as much money from the Emiratis if you embrace that position. That's not going to worry me. This is the reality. The Aqsa Mosque is equal theologically in status to Mecca itself.
So by that standard, it should be every Muslim's priority to get behind the protection of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And also, in many ways, I would imagine, to liberate Mecca, which you've talked about before. But let's focus just on
let's focus just on Palestine.
The time building.
That's a different. But I really think this betrayal is. I really don't know what these people are going to go to say to Allah when they meet Allah on the final day. I mean, you've destroyed Islam. Islam stops making sense. What, the Prophet migrated from Mecca to a little mosque in Ta'if before even Ta'if was Muslim, before what mosque in Ta'if? No, there's no historical record of a mosque in Ta'if that they're talking about. It's the only Aqsa Mosque is Alladhi Barakna Hawla, that we blessed. And that's where, you know, the center of the Abrahamic faith. The problem is that Zionist theology wants to take Jerusalem and not make it about the Abrahamic monotheistic legacy. It wants to make it about the Jewish legacy, a racial category. It is about Jewish history, not about monotheistic history. And that's a problem. And I wish, there isn't a single mainstream Muslim theologian who's published any significant work in mainstream presses, scholarly presses, about this very obvious point. I mean, and our voice is largely absent because Muslims have made themselves absent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this also actually underscores a lot of, I mean, obviously people recognize this at a certain level. I actually wanted to turn this to Laura to talk about the censorship that's taking place, because clearly, the media narrative, people are starting to see something different than they are used to seeing, and there's a lot of suppression taking place on social media, on Lara's page, when you show pictures of the evil that is happening on the ground, and then you get, censored because they say this is inappropriate. Well, why do you think it's inappropriate? It's happening in Palestine, exactly. So, but it's clearly in people's interest, in the people in power, it's in their interest not for people to see the reality of what's happening on the ground. So, Laura, I just wanted to see if you could share
Grace,
what you've been experiencing.
Grace, Laura, can I just say that, right before this, I was just reading a report. 20 hospitals in Gaza were bombed. Laura, why? Why? I mean, 20 hospitals in Gaza are bombed. Can you please say something? Because how is that not a war crime?
No, it is a war crime. That's exactly the problem. It is a war crime. And I mean, it's not the first time that Israel has been accused of war crimes. In the previous assaults on Gaza, numerous reports were established, fact-finding missions were deployed to Gaza, interviews were taken, photos, video evidence, on the ground, and war crimes, evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity was established, but nothing ever happens, precisely because of the Israeli exceptionalism that you alluded to earlier. I wanted to add, on this notion that they're targeting hospitals, they sent an airstrike to Doctors Without Borders office. Okay, they also targeted with an airstrike the Palestine Children's Relief Fund office, which is an American charity which operates in Gaza and provides life-saving treatment to Gazan children who can't get that treatment in Gaza. So they arrange for them to be taken outside. And the only reason they can't get it in Gaza is because of the Israeli siege on Gaza, right? So it's a problem Israel created. It's not just some natural problem that exists in Gaza. They also bombed a medicine factory earlier this week, which I watched on an Instagram live as it happened. They also murdered in their sleep 2 prominent Gazan physicians, right, one of whom was with Doctors Without Borders, and he worked at Al-Shifa Hospital. He was an internist, and he was the leader of the coronavirus response in Gaza, and another neurologist who was massacred with his family in an airstrike on his home. They were all killed, I believe, except for his son. So yeah, Israel, they targeted the Ministry of Health as well. That was bombed. The idea that Israel bombs hospitals and roads to hospitals and infrastructure dealing with medicine, I mean, this is not new. Israel routinely targets infrastructure and people who are helpful to the development of Palestinian society. When we say this is ethnic cleansing, we say that it's ethnic cleansing at every level. They are not only killing our people with the full brute force of their F-16s, but they are targeting specific people who they know that their loss will have a disproportionate impact on Gazan society. And, if you say, oh, well, if you take Israel at its word, which, by the way, in response to all of this, Israel said, well, we didn't mean to. And I swear to God, that's the actual quote that the government issued in response to questions about why did you target a family of 22 and massacre all of them in their sleep? Why did you target a family of 10? Why did you target a family of 5? Why did you hit all of these, various pieces of infrastructure that are related to medicine in some way? Israel said, we didn't mean to. I mean, can you imagine that how exceptional you must be to commit heinous crimes that are just undescribable, that just totally totally brutal. And just to be able to say we didn't mean to, and then that's it. That's where the you know, the case ends. You know, that's where, okay, the judge closes, you know, the file and says, oh, well, they didn't mean to, so, you know, case closed, right? That's what we're dealing with here. Now, onto the censorship point. This is exactly why the censorship is necessary, because this stuff is so outrageous that it's absolutely necessary to suppress it. One of the main ways that they suppressed it was by leveling to the ground the building housing the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. You know, it turned to dust. And, you know, so this is what we're dealing with. The notion, there's something which is very dangerous, which is that, you know, Israel likes to tell a lot of lies about itself. We talked about how it mentioned that it was, you know, it always says we're the only democracy in the Middle East. But not only that, they also say we're the most moral army in the world, which I don't even understand what that means, because what is a moral army? State violence is not moral to begin with. This whole premise needs to be checked. And a lot of my work on my podcast is dismantling the logical fallacy that is embedded in Zionism, because all of Zionism rests on a false premise. So the idea that you can have a moral army, what does that even mean? You know, they'll say other things. I mean, it's all over the rhetoric, right? So, but going to the censorship, Palestinians right now have been putting as much unedited footage out there all over social media. That means going on lives on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, and just showing people what it's like to live in Gaza. And I did one of these lives with my friend Joe Gaza, 93, on Instagram, and I was horrified. I could hear the bombs drop, and they were dropping every minute. I have never in my life experienced a terror like that. I myself was traumatized. And I wasn't even there. And he was like more calm than I was, because this is how much Palestinians in Gaza have grown used to the incessant state violence that is constantly perpetuated against them. I just want to give a quick anecdote. When my family was told to evacuate their residential building, they were the last ones out, because my uncle was sleeping. My aunt is deaf. She has a hearing aid. They did not hear that there was any evacuation happening. There is a clip which circulated all over the Arab news of the doorman to their building getting the phone call from the Israeli officer saying, we're going to strike now. And the doorman saying, please, please wait. There's still people in the building. They still have to evacuate. There's still families, right? So this is the level of dehumanization of the Palestinian. The notion that our houses must be destroyed. It's only a question of when. You know, when our colonial master decides that it's appropriate to destroy our house. And you can hear the officer saying, no, we're going to do it now. And all of these people crowding around the speakerphone saying, please, please give the people more time to just evacuate. And why? You know, the idea is they don't even challenge the premise that your house should be destroyed to begin with. We just accept it and take it as a reality. Well, of course the house must be demolished. You know, it's just a question of when. And Palestinians make a joke out of this in Gaza. They will say, you know, when they get these phone calls, they will say, okay, you know, when are you going to come? Okay, that's fine. Well, why don't you just hit it now? You know, because it's, you know, what am I supposed to do with 4 minutes to gather all of my belongings? You know, they make jokes out of this thing. They start to use sarcasm as, you know, against these officers. But the reality of the matter is that Israel, in its claim that it's the most moral army in the world, it doesn't always call. And most of the time it doesn't call, but it only calls to avoid huge civilian catastrophe, like in a case of a 15-story civilian building. But taking out 22 family members in one night, that's no problem. We don't have to call for that, you know? So just showing the level of dehumanization, it's beyond anything that we would ever accept. Going to the censorship, sorry, I get sidetracked.
No, this is so important. I mean, please feel free to share, because it's so important.
So we have already known prior to these events that there was heavy censorship happening on social media with respect to any language that was critical of Israel. Facebook itself hired some sort of a communications director, and I forget the exact title of this individual, but basically their job is to oversee what content is published on Facebook, and that includes Instagram. And that individual was a former member of the Israeli government. Okay, and this is something you can, the Intercept reported on this. You can Google this article from the Intercept. I believe it was Glenn Greenwald that wrote about this a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Now, in this recent within the scope of these recent events, we know because the Politico has reported that Facebook met with Israeli officials to discuss quote unquote online hate speech. Because anytime I post anything about what Palestinians are going through, it gets flagged and deleted as being hate speech. So I posted a photo of my family's residential building. It's called the Cairo Residential Tower in Gaza City, before it was hit, because I wanted people to see this is where my family lives, and this is where they live, and this is what it looks like before the airstrike is about to take it down. And that photo of just a building was flagged as hate speech and removed. And I had to then file a request to have it assessed, by an individual, and they told me it was a glitch and they gave it back to me. But it doesn't end there. They have been basically not alerting people to my lives, making it impossible for people to share my lives. Most people can't share them. And what do I do during my lives? I provide updates from on the ground in Gaza, because I collate all the information from my friends and family in Gaza they give to me, and then I put it out in the world for an English speaking audience to 30,000 followers on Instagram, right? So this is it's been I can't even describe the level of censorship. I've had people say I can't tag you in my posts. I've had posts that are deleted. I've had people say I can't message you. I've had people say, oh, I turned on your notifications so I would be alerted anytime you go live or anytime you post something, and I never see your content. I've had people say you used to come up as first, but now you come up as last. I've had people say I have to type your full name into the bar in order to find your page. It doesn't come up even though I check your page every day. So there is
you have to type it correctly.
And you have to type it correctly. So we know that this is happening not only based on our experience, but because Facebook admitted in the past to working with a former Israeli government member who works on with Facebook today to censor Palestinian content, delete entire Palestinian pages. This was reported in 2016, 2017. They would delete entire pages of hundreds of thousands of followers of Palestinian news, whether it be in Arabic and in English. And again, we're seeing a continuation of this today. We're also seeing that Israel's justice minister, as reported by Newsweek earlier this week, asked TikTok and Facebook to remove posts that, quote, incite violence against Israel. So what does that mean? I mean, these are vague terms. Anything can be considered incitement to violence if you say so. I mean, is showing evidence of war crimes and incitement to violence? You could possibly argue so, right? We also know that one of the major reasons for this censorship, and this was reported, I believe, by the Electronic Intifada, if I'm not mistaken, is that Facebook and Instagram have specifically targeted the word Zionist or Zionism, because in their view, that is equivalent to Judaism. And so any language critical of Zionism then gets flagged as hate speech. And this follows very concerted efforts and sustained efforts by the Israel lobby itself to cause a confusion between the two. There is this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which now includes any criticism of Israel, any criticism of Zionism. And Trump actually adopted that definition of anti-Semitism by executive order when he was in office. And nothing has changed. So what you're seeing now is companies and private entities are also adopting definitions of anti-Semitism that include and basically suppress any and all forms of critique of Israel and Zionism itself. This is really problematic because, as I've already mentioned, Zionism is racism. Zionism is white supremacy. If you can't call out white supremacy, then you are basically trapped in a void where your rights are being deprived, rights that are guaranteed to you under international law, but you have absolutely no way to vocalize this. So it's a very frustrating situation. Again, Palestinians are in a rights-based struggle. Our struggle has nothing to do with the fact that we dislike Jewish people. Judaism is a beautiful religion that has existed for 2,000 years. Zionism is a political ideology that has resulted in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians that has existed for a little over 100 years. The two are not the same. So Zionists want you to believe that every Jew that lived before the creation of Zionism wasn't actually a Jew because they weren't a Zionist. They want you to believe that the only way to be a Jew is to be a Zionist, and that you don't actually even have to follow God's law. You don't even have to believe in God. You just have to be a Zionist. So we have to understand that Zionism also, there's a very heavy influence of secularism and nationalism and this idea of trying to replace the religion following God's law as outlined in the Torah with a nationalistic ideology and stripping it of its actual faith components.
Laura, the absurdity, even it's just the straightforward thing that, especially we encounter in academia all the time, is that if you just talk about the amount of war crimes that were committed in 2014, the if you talk about the war crimes that have been committed now, that gets labeled as anti-Semitic. That when you say, listen, when Israel adopted the law that this is a Jewish state, which means that the Arab minority, the 1948 Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, 20% of the population, uh, are by law second-class citizens. They whatever participatory rights they get, they're always 20%. They are always a minority by definition. They are an insular and discrete minority in the language of in our language. And you say that is not a democracy, and you get the response, well, that's anti-Semitic. I mean, it really it goes when you say that Sheikh Jarrah, Sheikh Jarrah himself was a doctor that served in Salah ad-Din's army, and it goes back to the 12th century AD, and there have been families living in Sheikh Jarrah continuously from the 12th century AD, and even who knows about before, whatever the Crusades slaughtered. But there have been families that have been, and you can't just come and tell these families, well, you don't have the right paperwork, and it's the paperwork that we, as an occupying force, define as appropriate. So you don't have the right paperwork, get out. And then you're called an anti-Semite. I mean, the irrationality of this. So it gets to the point where you just say, well, am I dealing with a sane world? Am I dealing with anything that resembles sanity at all?
Can I add one thing? The irony, the irony in this whole debate is that if you insist that it's anti-Semitic to criticize Zionism and criticize Israel, you are actually being anti-Semitic. Because what you are doing is you are insinuating that there is something inherently violent about Judaism, that Judaism calls for ethnic cleansing, that Judaism requires you to expel people from their land. That's anti-Semitic, because that is thinking something badly of Jews just because they're Jews. And so they flip they flip the whole thing on its head. This is the thing with Zionist logic, is that it's always the opposite, and they create this new reality that they live in, that they operate in, where it doesn't matter if it's actually true. They can just say the opposite, and then they just push it forward very, very aggressively, and then that becomes the discourse. We're seeing the same thing, Dr. Khaled, with the discourse of Israel has a right to defend itself. Now, you and I both know that there is no right to defend itself from a people that you militarily occupy under international law. That right simply does not exist. There is no right for a brutal colonial power to pummel with, advanced weaponry, a caged civilian population, which it cages and doesn't allow to escape. That right doesn't exist under international law. But what do we hear constantly from all of these politicians? Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to defend itself. This is just simply not true from the perspective of international law, which is, the determinative framework in this instance. So I also wanted to say that Israel itself is not, does not hesitate to associate itself with known anti-Semites. Mm-hmm. Remember when Bolsonaro and Orban came to visit. Orban, who said that the Holocaust was kind of a good idea. I'm paraphrasing his words, but he's made some very suspect statements about the Holocaust. And when asked about whether this poses a problem to Israeli society, one of the individuals in the government, and I forget their name, said, no, well, he's one of us. Well, what does that mean?
What does that mean? Yeah.
What does that mean? Who are you? Who are you guys? That's look, the idea is, and I think you said it perfectly, Dr. Khalid. Or no, maybe you did not say it. Maybe this was from a previous talk I did today. But I see the Zionists exactly like ISIS. They're people that showed up many years, and I'm going to correct myself because there was a correction in the comments. Judaism is 3,300 years old, not 2,000. I haven't slept very much, so I made a calculating error. But these people show up, thousands of years after the religion has been doing just fine without it, and they say we're the real Jews, just like ISIS says we're the real Muslims. And all the rest of the Muslims are like, what are you talking about? We don't know who you are. You guys just showed up. We have no idea who you are. You guys are terrible. You don't read the Quran. You don't even pray. You do brutal, violent things. We have no idea who you guys are. You're not Muslim. You can't claim Islam. But this is exactly what the Zionists do. They cloak themselves in this religious discourse, but they could care less about religion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so let me ask you, both, you're both in lawyers, law professor, and this idea of Israeli exceptionalism. How do you see that becoming dismantled?
Oh man. Listen, maybe I'm jaded and getting old, and so I'd like to hear Laura.
Well, I think we can answer this question. It depends on how you look at it, right? Because if you're looking at it from the theological perspective as a Muslim, Muslims know that Palestine will be free, right? That's what every pious Muslim will tell you, is that this is all part of God's plan. And it's, Palestinians and Gazan people especially have an immense amount of tawakkul. I cannot express to you. I mean, when I speak to my family in Gaza, it's almost like it's definitely like I am more traumatized than they are, in the sense that they just say, this is what God wrote for us. And it's very difficult, but this is our fate. And they believe that, and they accept that, at least my family. And of course, it's horrifying and traumatic, and there's a lot of pain. But there is this notion that هذا اللي ربنا كتب لنا إياه. And I hear that.
God wrote, yeah.
And I hear that all the time. So if you look at it from a theological perspective, well, then you have to have faith, because you know that Palestine will be free if you're a Muslim, if you look at it from the Islamic framework. But if you separate it from the Islamic framework, I firmly believe that injustice is an unsustainable state of affairs, and that eventually humanity prevails. It's the story. It's just, it can't happen any other way, right? Because you cannot subject a people to this type of oppression forever and expect that they will simply lay down and die. As long as there's Palestinian people, there will continue to be resistance to oppression. And eventually the house of cards will fall, and the myths upon which Zionism was built will be dismantled. And I think we're beginning to see it. I don't know how long it will take, but I really believe that the process has begun, and we have seen it accelerate in the last 2 weeks or so. Another thing I wanted to mention was from a purely political science perspective. The support, the financial, diplomatic, support of the United States is not inevitable. It can change. It just has to get to the point where support for Israel becomes more costly for the United States than the benefit than they reap from it. And a lot of work needs to be done. Obviously, we're very far from that in sort of the mainstream political discourse in the United States. Obviously, there's a lot of shifts and movements happening on the grassroots level in the United States, but up above, we still see the I stand with Israel, Israel has a right to defend itself sort of dialogue, and no question, no understanding whatsoever. We saw an interview with I forget his name, Meeks, the guy who was responsible, one of the people in Congress who was interviewed about this upcoming weapons sale, and he just kept referring to the situation as violence in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it's like, what? That's so racist. You don't even know what you're talking about. Someone give this guy a history lesson. Tell him to call me. I'll explain everything in 5 minutes. So yeah, we're far from that. But I think, depending on the way that you look at it, whether it's, from a political perspective, a human perspective, a dignity perspective, a religious perspective, there's different ways to analyze it. But I firmly believe that the path is always towards liberation. And settler colonies, and imperial states, they fall. They always fall. I mean, look at ancient Rome and Greece. No, they were very powerful. We had so many powerful empires in history, and they all fell. It's a myth to assume that they are just destined to remain as they are.
So we're getting close. Oh, go ahead.
I want to hear Dr. Khaled respond to what I said.
No, I just want to say that, I wish we would, we have to focus on the immorality that confronts us. So it's not just the Israelis that blockade the Palestinians, it's also the Egyptians. And there is no way around it. Egyptians are complicit in a highly immoral act, and not just immoral, but also against international law. And I wish American Muslims would focus on what is an Islamically morally upright position. So from my perspective, it is incumbent upon American Muslims to condemn what Egypt does, to try to force the government. The fact that the American government continues to support a tyrannical government like the Egyptian state, that is complicit in a major war crime and a crime against humanity, like what they do to the Ghassans, is unconscionable and it's unacceptable. I mean, this I often hear, and this a lot of people would be surprised to know this, but I often hear on Israeli TV when Israelis are being interviewed about Palestinians, I will hear things that if an Arab or a Muslim said, they would be considered ISIS. I mean, I hear Israelis on the street interview, and they'll say the solution is to wipe out Palestinians, to nuke Palestinians. Oh, they need to be all, either they die or they have to all leave. I mean, very, very racist and extreme language. And the attitude of Americans when you tell them, listen, here, you could, it's right there, because it's every day on Israeli media. It's not, an occasional thing. It's every day. You hear this extremist type of language every day. And they basically have this indulgent attitude like, oh, well, it's just because they're very upset about being bombed by Hamas, and you have to understand, and you have to. This is precisely where I see the racism. This is, because when you forgive your own kind, the type of immorality that if an Arab committed or a Muslim committed, you would be, absolutely resolute about how immoral it is. I have trust in God, yes, but God only helps those who help themselves, and that is why I am my strictest and most unconditional condemnation always goes to my fellow Muslims, because if I can understand why a Jew who was raised by a family, maybe never met a Palestinian, never talked to Palestinian, a Jew who's, in school was always told that Palestinians are all terrorists, and maybe I can understand why they're so oblivious. But fellow Muslims who fail to do the right thing, I have no patience for. And I'm here talking because you've heard about just recent conflict. How many American Muslim leaders have spoken up unequivocally and clearly? How many American Muslim leaders have said, bland, vague things? How many American Muslim leaders have even adopted Zionist propaganda? Uh, that is what really gets to me.
Absolutely. So we're reaching our 2 hour mark. It has flown by, and this has been such an important and wonderful conversation. I want to kind of bring it to an end by, first of all, asking Laura, where would you recommend that people, one, donate? I know you have said in other places this is not about humanitarian crises. It's not that Palestinians want money. They want, political, they want support. But of course, people want to donate and they want to help given the crisis taking place. So please let us know where would be a good place to donate. And secondly, where would you recommend people get their news about Palestine, where it's truthful? Like, where do you get it? And I also want to, of course, highly recommend your podcast and, trying to follow you with social media, hopefully hopefully you can get around the attempts to censor.
Yeah, so I've just put in the chat right now, definitely. I mean, humanitarian relief is obviously needed in Gaza. When I made that video, it was in the aftermath of the airstrikes on my family's house, and I was very angry, and I wanted to put out a call to action. My family, my brother-in-law's family, had been expelled from the Palestinian city of Yabna in 1948, and then they were expelled down into Gaza. They lost their homes. The Zionists took their homes in 48, and then they expelled them into Gaza. And for decades, they lived in Gaza in refugee camps until they were able to build the wealth again in order to be able to buy the apartments that they had in this building. And so it was, my uncle, my aunt, and then my brother-in-law's brother and his wife, and they were all living together, and they had managed to get themselves out of the camps, and now they're being made refugees once again. And so for myself, I said, okay, the solution is not keep building more apartments that keep getting bombed. We just need an end to this. We need a political solution. We need our rights. And so it was in that context that I made that video. But of course, I mean, humanitarian relief is needed in the immediate. It's the immediate need. And so I would recommend Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Their offices were bombed, and they need a lot of help to rebuild and also continue the excellent work that they're doing. But also, I'm working with an NGO that is on the ground in Gaza, and the link is in my bio on Instagram, and I've provided my Instagram handle at Gazan Girl with an N. And so if people are interested, they can go to that charity. It's a charity out of Canada, and they have humanitarian workers on the ground right now in Gaza that are doing everything to provide relief in terms of like medical supplies to Al-Shifa Hospital and other hospitals, food, water, urgent humanitarian needs right now. So that fundraiser is going to be up for a little while. And I think the last time I checked, we've already raised like 25,000 Canadian dollars. So I'm really happy about that. And inshallah, it will just continue. And in terms of, news, I think the best place to start is books, because you can't really find out what happens. You can't get a full picture just by reading, an article or reading news. So some of my favorite scholars on this point, you can start with Rashid Khalidi's book, 100 Years War on Palestine. That's an excellent primer on this issue. You can also read The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Professor Ilan Pappé, who is an Israeli historian who talks about how Palestinians were expelled from their homes. And another excellent book which talks about the history of the Palestinian civilization is Noor Masalha's book, Palestine, a 4,000-Year History. That's a book that I enjoyed reading as well. And if you really want to get deeper into this issue, go on our website, palestinepod.com. And I'm going to put that in the chat as well, because for each episode, we provide a full list of sources that we relied upon in the preparation of that episode, which includes the books that we consulted. So you have a rich collection of books and articles and scholarly articles to choose from on, the various subjects that we address on the podcast. Everything we say is substantiated. We do all the research beforehand, so that right now, because I'm running on no sleep, I'm making little slip ups like this, but usually when we're in podcast mode, everything is prepared in advance, and we do a full bibliography so that nobody can say anything to us. And in fact, it's a protection for us, because when you choose to speak out about Israel, you constantly get attacked left and right. People accuse you of lying. I get accused of lying all the time. I'm not lying about what happened to me. It's the story of my life. So it's a protection for us. We do it just to ensure, and a lot of times we rely on Israeli sources to prove our point, because they are very honest about what they've done. They sometimes cover it up a little bit less than the Western media tends to. So you can find a great deal of sources there. And then if you still are hungry for more sources, you can always reach out to me, and I can recommend a specific book for the issue that interests you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I want to give each of you a moment just to, if you have any closing remarks, because we're at past 4:00, but, just to close it out, if you have any last thoughts that you want to share. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been extremely valuable, I'm sure, for everyone listening. So I don't know who wants to go first, if you have any last closing thoughts.
I want to hear Laura last, because I think she's mashallah, she's the future. And she this is her life. For God's sake, this is her family. This is so I'll just say that from what I underscore, the Palestine issue and how indigenous people have been often treated in so many colonial settings have made me very skeptical about the genuineness of claims about how much we actually are, how much we are civilized, and to what extent we have actually embraced the human rights paradigm. I wish people would stop reading history from the perspective of the colonizer generally, and make it a point to read history from the perspective of the indigenous populations that had to deal with what the colonizer did. And that's across the world, everywhere. And then you might start understanding how the ways that our world needs to change for there to be greater justice. That's point one. Point two, and quickly, is that my message to American Muslims is that if you are an American Muslim and you look to whatever imam or whatever religious scholar or whatever religious leader you admire, and they don't take a clear and unequivocal position on moral issues like Jerusalem, like Palestine, and theological issues like Jerusalem, and ethical issues like condemning tyrants in Egypt and Saudi and Emirat, if they don't, then you must disassociate and disown. It is no longer acceptable to say, no, mashallah, Muslim brothers, no. They are immoral human beings. They don't represent Islam, and you don't want to end where they are going to end up in the final day. Honestly, it's bad company in the final day. I wouldn't want to be in that position. So that's my message.
Do you want to close it out for us, Laura?
I just received a text message from my book club ladies telling me to end with hope, who are intently watching this. So I guess I have to end with hope. Well, look, just know that there is a reward for those who stand up against injustice, and that, if we are to be guided by the teachings of our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, he told us that, if you can do something about an injustice with your hands, do so. And if not, Do it, change the injustice with your words. And if you can't, then at least hate it in your heart. And for many people in the United States, we are blessed to at least be able to speak out about it, even though we're being censored. Generally, our lives are not at risk, as they would be if we were in other countries that use much more authoritarian forms of cracking down on people calling out for their rights. So if you're in the United States and you're Muslim and you're silent about this issue, I really urge you to reconsider your position, because what is Islam if it's not rooted in justice, and it's not rooted in an ethical framework that upholds the dignity of all humanity, of all human beings? It's not just about Palestine either. It's about everyone. It's about all oppressed and colonized people, because we're all fighting the same evil and the same injustice fundamentally. So it's really more of a call to action to Muslims who are apolitical, or think that, oh well, it's just happening over there and I'm comfortable in my life over here. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately we can't do this. If we're going to try to convince humanity that our religion makes sense and is worthy of something, then our religion has to be a benefit to humanity. And if Muslims are not advocating for humanity and rights and freedom and dignity and liberty and all of these things which democracies and liberalism claim to offer, but in reality they don't, well, then we're not really upholding the values of our faith as we believe it to be. So maybe that's not as hopeful as my sisters would like, but it's more of a call to sort of check yourself and where you are on this issue and other issues related to injustice.
Absolutely. Well, to me, the two of you are the hope, because you're the, like when I think about, Lara, your story, where you started, where you are, and just, the power of your education, your articulation, your passion, your commitment, this is a role model for every Muslim who cares about doing something important for our faith. And for Dr. Abul Fadl, this is like what he's sharing through our Project Illumine, understanding the Quran in a way that we've never been exposed to before, is hope for the future. And it demonstrates that Islam is, has a timeless, powerful message that is more relevant in our day than ever. And and the fact that we are able to educate ourselves through the tafsir is going to have infinite potential for empowering us for change for future generations, even if we don't see it in our day and age. So I want to thank both of you very much for your time. I want to thank everyone who took the time to stay with us. I noticed that people who have been on the webinar have been with us this whole time, so thank you. And I would like to please encourage you, if this was valuable for you, please spread the word about Usuli Institute, about our work, about this webinar, about Lara, and everything that people are doing to fight for good. We want to grow this community of critical thinkers, people who care about social justice and are not afraid to stand up and speak truth to power. And I'd like to invite you to join us every Friday for our khutbah, which I believe is the best way. If you have, everyone's busy, no one has time, but if you make one investment a week in understanding your faith, just watch the Friday khutbah. Even if you can't join us live, we always have the recording afterwards. And it's we make a point to connect Muslims with their tradition, pull out the moral lessons, and then apply it to something happening in the real world. So you understand, what should the Muslim perspective be, from a moral, just, ethical perspective, engaged in all of the challenges that we face as Muslims today. So please spread the word so we can grow our community of critical thinkers and social justice soldiers for goodness. So thank you again for being with us, and we'll look forward to inshallah more talks in the future. Thank you, Lara, and inshallah may you all may God be with you and help you be the best you can be. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. This has been such a pleasure, such an honor. Thank you so much, both of you. Assalamu alaikum.